Wait for a few more people to join, and then let's get stuck into a topic which I'm sure kind of instills fear in every founder. I don't know if you found
Yeah, I think it's
that.
a topic which is misunderstood in some ways. There's lots to talk about today.
Good. Well, we're gonna get into it. Let's make a start. So, hi everyone. My name is Ryan. I'm from Growth Studio, and this is the first of a number of webinars that we're going to be doing. Really trying to delve deep into some topics that we know are really burdensome to founders, and actually areas where we know we can kind of alleviate some of that burden. And nothing instills fear in a founder as much as a concept of grant funding. Now, I know that I look around and I see founders who are constantly raising funds, as every founder should be constantly raising funds. And grant funding is often that it's often that area that people almost avoid, or they don't look into because they feel like it's so burdensome. So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. In the background, ladies and gents, we have Camilla and Paul, who will be manning the chat. Paul, do you want to come and say hello? There's Paul right there, and you can all see Camilla. So they're going to be manning the chat. Please keep your questions coming in. We're going to be either answering your questions in the chat, or we're going to be posing them to you, Chloe, shortly.
hmm
So as I mentioned, grant funding, it instills fear. So that's why, Chloe, we've got you here. You are the expert
Yeah.
in all things grant funding. Do you want to maybe introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the grants industry for about 10 years. I've personally raised around 10 million, but I've worked in teams that have raised around sort of 4 million in one quarter. So I headed up a grant writing consultancy for about 4 or 5 years, then moved on to Grantry, and I was there for about 2 years and headed up near the end for the last sort of 6 months the grants team, and then moved on from there to a local SME where I developed a grants department. So yeah, that's still going strong. I now in Sharp Insight. So I have my consultancy. And one aspect that I've seen come up time and time again, it's just the lack of knowledge and understanding
Mm.
of grants and how to apply. There's lots of information in terms of, the scope and like eligibility criteria and all that kind of stuff, but there's a lot of jargon, so it's not always easy to understand. And even like some of the documents that are needed, like a project plan or working out work packages, there's a certain style that's expected, and you don't really know what it is as you're kind of going into it. So you have to almost learn the hard way as you're going through. Yeah, so really looking
Yeah.
forward to getting stuck into this topic today.
Good. Look, so and I think like something you mentioned there is really worth pointing out. Sometimes what I found is that the questions that are asked in the grant application often indicate what the assessor is trying is or what they're thinking, and sometimes those questions don't mirror what they're thinking. So getting into the brain of the assessor is actually something I'm hoping we delve into
hmm
today. It's also a great opportunity to quickly point out that our next program, which is called GS Select, is taking 8 to 10 startups who are solving the triple planetary crisis. That's biodiversity loss, pollution, and climate change. And we're supporting them for the entire year rather than just a 3-month program, introducing them to investors. Now, the reason why I'm pointing that out is a key pillar in that program is going to be exploring grant funding. So if anyone's interested in finding out more or applying for Growth Studio Select, Camilla will post a comment, post a link. Please do check that out. But before we get into the tips and tricks of how to crush your grant fund application, Chloe, who should be paying attention to this? What sort of companies, what sort of startups should be really paying attention?
So if you've got a very early stage idea, you might be a little bit too early for a grant. So if you're around the proof of concept kind of stage, it's measured through technology readiness levels.
Mhm.
So maybe have a look at those online if you haven't come across that before. That's something that NASA uses to measure the maturity of an innovation. And that's one of the measures that grant funders use to understand where you're at the beginning of your grant project and where you're going to be at the end. So the sweet spot for grant funding is around 3 to 4, which is proof of concept, trying to figure out the feasibility of some of the technical aspects, particularly if they're technically risky. And at that point, you might have an understanding as to the customer demand. So you might have a wait list, expressions of interest, so pretty much ready to go, but you just need that that grant funding to be able to enable you to develop the technology to get it to around sort of technology readiness level, kind of 6, 7. So it's closer to market. So right at the very top of the scale is 9, and that's where it's ready to go into market.
And what sort of amounts are we talking about? Is question one. And question two is, are we talking about Innovate UK or UK-based grants here? Are we talking about European grants? Set the context for us.
Yeah, sure. So Innovate UK is where they're a council which facilitate a lot of the grant funding, well, particularly innovation grant funding. But if you go onto the KTN, which is the Knowledge Transfer Network website, you'll see that there's different industries and sectors where there's lots of different competitions. So in sustainability, we've got ARIA, NATO, open innovation competitions designed to deliver contracts for innovation. So there's lots to go at. For Innovate UK and UKRI, which is the umbrella for Innovate UK and the rest of, well, some of those other competitions that I mentioned. So generally speaking, it does need to be around that TRL mark.
Great.
But you'd need to look at the eligibility criteria and the scope and things just to figure out if maybe you need to be a little bit further along if you're doing a demonstration project, or maybe a little bit earlier if you're kind of figuring out things very early stage. So for EU, that is for very big, really like for Horizon Europe, that's for very specific, but usually big grant funds. So they can take quite a long time to develop because you need to be part of a consortium and partner with different organizations across Europe, which might be universities, other SMEs. So the pot's usually bigger, but the developed technology is usually around sort of TRL 7, 8, because you want to see if you can expand into those different areas, or how does that particular product work in a different context.
Great. Well, look, I think we should get stuck straight into this. I'm really keen to learn more about what exactly I can do and how I can work with my clients, and no doubt everyone on the webinar is interested to know how they can crush their grant application. That's a strong word, so over to you.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously I can't guarantee that just by following this you're gonna like win or be completely successful, but hopefully it will inform your grant applications and improve them. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen because I've got some slides just to go through, just because it's just a bit easier to explain with the visuals. So just quickly, our grants for you. So this might help you decide whether you're at a good point to go for grants or not. So grant funding is usually for projects which contribute towards the societal, economic and environmental goals that the UK has, and maybe that particular grant funding body. And also it advances technology. So what we want to see is that wider strategies. So for example, if you've got an AI product, then you might want to look at the UK AI strategy just to show that it is helping to advance technology and knowledge in that particular area. So then the UK can become like a leader in that particular sector. So that's useful. Also, the project that you're doing for innovation funding is R&D, so research and development, maybe business expansion, upskilling, training, and innovation activity. So it's more about what people are doing rather than looking at capital expenditure, which can be a bit of a tricky area. So different grants are suitable for that, like local grants rather than innovation grants, because they want to see that people are, learning, doing, figuring out new ways of doing things. Also, bank loans and equity funding, so private equity and VC funding just they're not interested in helping you with the project because it's too technically risky. So that's where grants are good, because it can help mitigate that risk, because it's there to support risky innovation. So grants are not good for you if your project does not include innovation, so it's kind of business as usual, or setting up a business, so rent, equipment, that kind of thing. That's not really suitable for a grant. Also, you'd need to look at the costs for the project if they're eligible. So there's lots of information about that online. So it's worth checking that. But usually the finances that aren't eligible are kind of related again to business as usual. Also, you need the funding immediately. So the downside of grants is that the timeline can take months. So if you need to have the funding right now, then grants is probably not the right thing for you, unless you're going for maybe a smaller competition and you can see that the turnaround times are quite quick and they're expecting the grant competition to happen soon. Also, who you have in your team. So you need to have enough people in your team that can deliver business as usual, as well as the project. So one thing that I've seen in the past is where founders have gone for grants and they've won it, but they've said they're going to do so much in there that they've overstretched themselves a little bit. So something that I'm going to talk about in a little while is about that grant strategy. So maybe kind of breaking the projects down into smaller pieces and thinking, let's start small, build up our experience, and get the grants kind of bigger and more ambitious as we're going along, and building up a track record. And also, yeah.
I was just going to ask, is it fair to say in that case that that grant funding is best suited to technologies that are disruptive and novel, or?
Yeah, definitely. So for Innovate UK, I mean, depending on the competition, they're looking for game-changing, impactful technology. Yeah. But yeah, it depends on the grant. So that's typically for the smart grant, but sometimes for the themed competitions, they want to achieve something very specific. So your technology might help them to achieve that. And if it's innovative, then it might be better than what's currently available.
It's a high-risk project, essentially.
Yes, yeah. Technically, from a technical perspective. Yeah. And finally, your project does not align with the grant competition objectives. So make sure that you read the eligibility and scope criteria very, very carefully, because you don't want to waste your time. Put all that time and effort into writing a grant. It can take around 80 to 100 hours to write a grant application.
Wow.
So it's very, very time consuming. But that said, why should you try grants? So they're non-repayable. So it might be worth the effort because you don't need to pay it back like you would other forms of funding. It's non-dilutive, so that means that you're not giving away any equity or shares or anything like that. It mitigates risk, so kind of back to that technical risk side of things. So it's there to help you take those risks and to be more innovative and competitive. And finally, it stimulates innovation, because I think if you've got that safe space to be able to explore things in a project, then you're probably more likely to want to innovate.
Yeah, I think we find a growth studio that investors look quite highly upon grant funds as well, because essentially it means that private investors' money can be spent on driving the commercial side of the business, whilst grant funding can drive the R&D, the IP development. Do you find that as well, that they kind of that the investors look positively upon this?
Yeah, because in one way, it's kind of seen to validate the idea. Because to even have got the funding, you need to have shown so much. You've got a good revenue model, business model, you've got the right team. So in a way, the grant funding body's done a lot of that hard work for the investor, because they're kind of looking at similar things. Is it a strong team? Have they got the skill and things? So I have seen grant funded startups win funding because they will get VC funding because they've had grant funding.
Right. Yeah.
So it can definitely help. But there is a lot of text on here, but it kind of looks a bit blocky, but what I wanted to explain here is the different funding percentages. So it's not usual that grant funding is 100% of a project. So if a project size is around sort of 500,000 and it's 70% funded, that means the grant funding equates to about 350,000. So there's match funding that's needed. So that can be a bit of a blocker in some ways for very early stage companies, because they'll need to have that funding up front to be able to match to get the full project budget together. So back to those TRL levels that I mentioned. So TRL 1 to 2, this might be fundamental research and a feasibility study, but this is usually kind of university based. So it's about developing that idea rather than really thinking about the commercial aspect of things.
So we're still in a laboratory in TRLs 3 to 6.
Yeah, well, it's sort of 1 to 2.
1 to 2.
Yeah. And then when you're thinking about the application of it, and I suppose it kind of goes from like an invention to then innovation, which is we're thinking, what are the use cases? How can we commercialize it? Whose problem are we solving? Who's going to buy it? That's something that can be explored more in TRL level 3 to 6. So this might be a feasibility study. So you might have a proof of concept, but you need to kind of figure out maybe, can we create a data set? Can we develop that algorithm or whatever it might be? But this is the perfect time to develop that technology, and also to see if it fits into a realistic environment, because you might find that you've got a great product, but then it doesn't actually help anyone or it doesn't kind of fit the need. So that's why an industrial research project is really good, because then you can get quite a lot out of the project, because you can look at feasibility. So can it work? But also, will it work in a particular environment? So that I really like industrial research projects. And then finally, if you've already got a product, but there's not very much innovation, because you're kind of later stage, that's when the experimental development project would be good. So it means that the amount of funding is lower. So here you can see it's gone down from 70% to 45%. But it means that you're closer to market, but there's still some innovation and R&D to do, but there's just not as much compared to earlier stage, less mature innovation. So the Innovate UK loan is also good for that, as well as the Smart Grant kind of pitching it as an experimental development project.
And Chloe, so if a grant funds, let's say, I want to make up this number, let's say it funds 70% of an R&D project, where would that team or that startup get the remaining 30%?
Yeah, that's a good question. It needs to come from a low risk source, because it has to be in the bank account when if you're to win it, so on that notification date. So it could be a loan in principle, or if you're talking to investors and you're close to like closing, it could be ring-fenced amount. It could be reinvesting profits. It could come from family and friends. But higher risk sources like crowdfunding, when you can't really guarantee that the money's going to be there, it's too risky. So because once you win the grant, then you have to go through due diligence. So you have to show that you've got money in the bank account, essentially, for that 30%, because the grant comes in arrears. So having that cash means that you can pay for the first 3 months and then you get it paid back.
Got it.
Yeah, and if that funding is not in the bank account, then there is a risk that you can't go ahead with the grant.
Got it. So you need to give assurance in a grant funding application, essentially, that you are going to be able to cover the remainder. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so that's really important. So here it's kind of showing that that you've planned for the 30% match funding. You know how much grant funding you're going to get and how to pitch the maturity of the innovation due to the type of project. So this is something that can be quite confusing, because if you're coming to a grant sort of fresh, you might not really understand what the difference is between, feasibility study and experimental development, because experimental development sounds like it is very early stage rather than it being late stage. So that's why I think this is important for helping you write the really good grant project, because you understand how to pitch it and how you're going to show the level of development and the project of the technology as to how far the innovation is going to mature.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the TRO level set an expectation as to what the assessors
Yeah,
be reading in the grant fund. So it's important to almost self-assess where you are. And these TRL levels aren't necessarily clean silos either. So
no.
it really does depend on how you articulate yourself in many ways as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's useful to even like state we are TRO now
Mhm.
and we want to be TRO, whatever at the end, because it's talking their language, even though they don't have really any of that in the in the headings or anything like that. But that's something that I would definitely recommend. Um, Also, what I think might be useful to those here today is the similarities and differences between a pitch deck and a grant application, because I think founders are much more familiar with pitch decks. So I'm sure you found there's lots of different ways of doing pitch decks, right?
Yeah, and I think you're right though. I think a pitch deck everyone feels more comfortable with than maybe the grant application. And I think you pinpointed one of those reasons why it's the language as well, right? So
Mm,
there's
mm.
certain language that's going to resonate with investors versus other language that's going to resonate with those who are responsible for public money. So this, I think, is
Yeah.
a critical point.
Yeah, and there's so many similarities because you still need to do all this stuff that you would normally do in a pitch deck. And I was kind of listening on a webinar yesterday about grant funding, and some founders just put together a grant application because they want to get feedback on their value proposition and stuff. Because you get feedback from around sort of 3 to 5 assessors. So even if you don't win anything, you still benefit because you get feedback and you get it from experienced people in the industry. So that can sort of help give a steer as to maybe your problem that you think's like shared amongst lots of people, or maybe even how you're articulating your value proposition.
That's a really interesting way of getting feedback. I'm not sure it's the meanest of approaches, but it's an
It's
approach.
not.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I thought that was quite interesting that some people use that as a strategy for getting feedback. Um, but yeah, so just in terms of like what's usually on a pitch deck, we have the company purpose. So the motivation as to why you even set up the company and are interested in this problem, that part of the storytelling is important in pitch, like your pitch deck and your pitch, but it's also important in a grant application, because if you imagine being an assessor, just reading loads of grant applications, I think that it would be nice to have one where something might resonate a bit with you, because you just think, oh, this person really feels very passionate about this because maybe of this experience, or they've seen this market opportunity, or whatever it might be. So the company purpose, your purpose, that can be something that you have right at the very beginning, when you're writing the grant. But yeah, having a problem that you're looking at solving is so important. So when I've assessed grants, because I've done a lot of grant reviews, some of the issues that I see is explaining the big problem, so the macro, but not linking it to the micro,
Mm.
so the individual problem and why someone would buy this in the future to fix their problem. So it doesn't necessarily need to be B2C. It could be even B2B, or within a value chain or supply chain. So why do you need to be part of it? Like how is it making something better, and whose problem are you solving? So that is so important to outline in your grant application.
So we find that in pitch decks as well, right? Where people over egg the problem that they're solving when they don't necessarily
Mm,
need to, right? No one's team or startup out there is going to solve an entire problem, but they can be very disruptive in a smaller problem that contributes to a
yeah.
big problem. So I think that these first, what is it, 3, 6, 9, these first 12 boxes, I think most people are going to be quite familiar with. I'm looking at the
Mm,
four white boxes. So I think
mm,
that's the new part, that people are probably less familiar with. I certainly am.
yeah. Yeah, so all of the things that we have in a usual pitch deck is important, but instead of thinking about it from a business perspective and pitching it to an investor, you're pitching it about a project, and you're
Hmm.
pitching it to get taxpayers' money. So there's kind of a different audience and reasoning behind it. But yeah, like you said, still be familiar with these different aspects, but with the white boxes here, it's thinking about what the project goals are. So with the project, it's almost thinking about it as like it's going to become a separate entity. And you're thinking, the company purpose is the context, but what are you going to be putting into it to make it a success, and why are you doing it? And what are the outcomes, and how is that going to help your business, the market, society, the economy, UK sector, etc. So it is kind of really thinking like big picture in terms of the project.
Because essentially that's what R&D is, right? R&D is saying, I've got nothing yet, but look at
Mm,
the vision that I'm putting forward as to what we could potentially develop. And that's probably what people want to see. Chloe, tricky
mm,
question for you.
mhm.
Um, a question, you tell me if it's tricky or not.
Yeah.
Um, do you need to have a project in mind
Mhm.
before you find a grant fund? Or can you look at a grant fund and say, actually, with this money, I could create something new, or I could create a new project based around the grant fund.
Yeah, that is a good question. I think being like proactive in what you want to do in the future, what is genuinely going to help your business succeed, I think that is good to map out. So have like a product roadmap or an innovation or a technology roadmap. And then from those, the projects could kind of evolve. So it's a good grant application is a match between that project, the competition, and and your business. So all of the things kind of need to come together. So yeah, it is important to have a strong project, and you can identify them early on, and it might influence how you look for grants, where you look for grants. And yeah, I think with the sort of with the white boxes here, like the project goals and objectives and how you're going to design it and approach it, all of that kind of stuff is worth thinking up front, because what I've seen happen in the past is they think, oh, we've got this skills gap or this partner gap, and we really need to get this university on board like now because the deadline's in a month. But that's too late, really, um, because with working with a university, that's around sort of 6 weeks sort of lead time by the time you've got all the JES form and the financials all sorted. So I think it's worth being as proactive as possible and thinking about your projects, but how would you make them successful?
Right.
So what partners would you need? What subcontractors? And being proactive in starting those conversations, maybe even doing like small pilot projects together to show that you've got like a good working relationship, because that's something that they're interested in as well. So if you are in a consortium, like how have you worked together and what successes have you had in the past? Because when it comes to IP and the development of the IP that you mentioned, um, that can become a little bit complicated if
Hmm.
you're doing a combined project. So if you show that you've got a good working relationship and maybe you've worked through some of those issues before, then that will just strengthen because they have more confidence rather than a cold relationship, no background. That's kind of highly risky just from a project team perspective, because if you don't know each other very well and you haven't got any experience working together, then it could be a risky thing for the project success.
I mean, the summary I'm seeing from this slide, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you need to, like, the assessors have to protect public money, to give them all the assurance that they need to show that how you're going to spend the money in a sensible, logical, systematic way for very, very clear outcomes, and you've minimized
Yeah,
the risk of failure.
exactly. And quantify that as much as possible, evidence it. All of those kind of aspects are some things that first-time grant applicants don't do. So if you can demonstrate and quantify as much as possible your return on investment, um,
Forecasted return on investment, presumably.
yeah, forecasting, yeah, your revenue, like you've worked it out using sales forecast methods, um, that you've got traction, that you've got interest. If you can quantify and evidence as much as possible, then that just adds much more credibility, and the assessor's a lot more confident in the application.
So look, I don't want to hold you on this slide for too long, but this does raise,
Mhm.
it reminds me of two very different approaches I've seen. One
Mm,
approach has been to focus purely on the tech, on the R&D, what we're developing.
mm,
And another approach I've seen is focusing purely on the commercials. What you're saying, if I understand correctly, is
Mm.
this is R&D, but you
Mm.
need to show a commercial outcome from this. And I think
Yes.
that's a balance to maybe strike.
Yes, yes, definitely. I mean, some grant competitions can steer, one way or the other, but with the smart grant in particular, that they're interested in the commercialization because they want the return on investment. But for others, it's still important to consider the technical aspect and also to explain it in a way where it's understandable to someone that's not an expert in your area, and use as least amount of jargon as possible. But yeah, also showing the commercial potential. So both are important. Yeah. 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 So another thing to kind of think about as well is how you're going to measure the project's success. So we've got the return on investment that we've mentioned, which might be like VAT, corporation tax, revenue, um, particularly sort of within the 5 years after the project's finished. I mean, it depends on what TRL your innovation is going to be at the end. But say it's sort of around 7, then you can kind of safely say, within 2 years, it's probably going to, be commercialized. In year 5, we're going to grow into whatever markets. But yeah, so that market aspect is also worth noting, that is something that is common for it not to be done very well in a grant application. So with pitch decks, I guess you must see with market sizing the TAM, SAM, SOM.
Yes, yes, the market
Yeah,
size, total addressable market, serviceable market, and an obtainable market.
that's right. Yeah. So in a grant application, sometimes people don't use that method, but they should use those methods when they're using grant sizing and looking at
Actually, if
competition.
you've got a solid pitch deck that's validated,
Mm.
half the work is done essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Yes, yeah. So it's kind of getting in that mindset that all the time and effort and all the calculations, everything that you've done for your pitch deck, you should take that similar approach to your grant application.
What about language though? I mean, I'm assuming here
Mm.
that you need to be a bit more technical in your articulation, or is that not true?
Um, I mean, you still need to show that you've got, the technical knowledge, but explaining it in a way where it's people that aren't experts in your area can understand,
Okay.
because you'll have 3 to 5, depending on the competition, assessors. Because the smart grant has now gone down to 3, but I think the
Mhm.
others are still on 5 assessors. So some of them might be maybe industry experts, but maybe not an expert in that particular technology. So if you're using a lot of technical language, you might lose them. But you do have the appendices where you're able to visualize a lot of the technical aspects. So I like to use the first page as like the front end, or like the finished product is what I think it's going to look like. So I might use technical drawings, and then the second page for that to explain maybe the architecture or the process flow, or something like that, almost like the recipe. And
Right.
then the first page is more like, if look using a cake analogy, like what the cake is going to look like at the end. And then the second page is like how I'm going to make that cake.
Right.
So you can really use the appendices to your advantage to visualize what you're going to do and what it's going to look like at the end, but with a lot of explanations. And that's a lot easier when you've got the visual diagrams and representations.
That's a good approach. So essentially, it's the old adage, a picture paints 1,000 words, right?
Yes,
So
yeah,
seeing the overall flow of what you're doing means
yeah,
that actually, arguably, that makes it easier to section out the narrative into much more consumable chunks of.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, and also thinking about the whole grant application as a story, so end to end, and maybe even storyboarding it up front. So when you're writing it initially, you've already got the things that you want to highlight throughout. So why you're doing it, the market opportunity, how it's innovative, how it's better than anything available on the market. So then when you go to those questions, it's deep diving them, but there's no surprises. You're just explaining it in more detail.
Good.
Okay, so moving on to the next one. I haven't got a lot of slides, by the way. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to explain the route to grants. So a couple of things we've kind of touched upon. So the first one is to have a grant strategy and a plan. So with innovation, what innovation means to Innovate UK is the sort of more radical disruptive types of innovation rather
Mm,
than sustainable incremental sort of continuous improvement types of innovation. So that kind of speaks to that technical risk aspect of the grant project. But yeah, having that roadmap. So what do things look like in the next 5 years, 3, 5 years for your company? And how would a grant project help you get there? Because you might be starting your grant project maybe 10 months, 8, 10 months after you've started to write it.
mhm.
So that's why needing the money immediately isn't going to be a good fit for your company. But if you're thinking about things in the future, um, starting at 10 months later, and then the project might last a couple of years. So you're thinking about things, sort of 3 to 5 years in advance, really.
I mean, you're
Um,
essentially saying that there should be another, almost a strategic strand to the business.
yeah.
Is that right? Like, I mean, from the way you're describing it, I feel like we at Growth Studio and
Mm.
all of our clients and all of our startups should be constantly, maybe on a weekly or bi-monthly basis, evaluating what grants are it. What's the right frequency to start to evaluate grants? Because you've got to plan for this.
Yeah, I would say at least every 2 weeks or month. Yeah. You don't want to leave it too sort of far between because some of the deadlines are quite short. So if
Yeah.
you've already done the hard work and thinking ahead of time in terms of what your innovation is going to be, what your projects could look like, what the ideal grant application or competition would be, then when you see it, you're all ready to go.
Hmm.
And you've already done ideally the market sizing, you've looked at the competition and maybe considered your sales forecast and stuff. Yeah, it's looking at a grant as part of a fundraising strategy as well.
Hmm.
Because if you want to blend the angel investment, maybe with private equity, or sorry, with the so angel investment with a grant fund, then you've already had those conversations up front. You might have included it in your pitch deck. So it's just thinking about things in advance, because what I found is with grant funding, sometimes it's ad hoc or just by chance in terms of when people apply for it. But you can get so much more out of it and write better applications if you've planned it like much further in advance.
So this again might be another tricky question, but I want to pose it to you anyway. But let's maybe work this out together. So
Uh-huh.
if we're saying that it's going to take about 80 to 100 hours,
Yeah.
bit finger in the air, but let's go with that, right? To
Mm.
fill out one grant application to the best it can possibly be.
Yeah.
And then we're saying we're checking every 2 weeks. So I would assume that maybe, or I put to you that maybe we need at least 3 months, 3 to 6 months. So I find a grant application
Mm.
today. The deadline should at least be 3 months away, minimum, right? To give me the right time.
Um, Yeah, I mean, ideally, sometimes grant competitions come up and you have about a month to apply for them. But then you
Right.
have others which are open a lot, like the Smart Grant. So you can have much more opportunity to plan for that one. But if you think, oh, that grant which looks at, I don't know, it might be the contract for innovation or an open innovation challenge, for example, then you might think this is the perfect one for this part of the innovation that I've got planned. And you've already got it figured out. And then you just check the eligibility
Got it.
criteria and the scope and stuff. So it's just having it all at hand, and I suppose articulating it to the wider team. So if they see any opportunities that might come up on in a newsletter or in a network or a conversation or anything, everyone's kind of ready to suggest it to get going on it as soon as possible.
Yeah, because I think one of the challenges that we've had is someone needs to stop their job essentially, for lack of a better term, in order to start filling out the grant application. For a small team, resources so
Yeah.
so stark. So what suggestions would you have for a team that wants to fill out a grant application, but it does mean that they're now reducing the time and effort on another part of their business?
I suppose it's that trade-off. and the opportunity cost, like is it worth it?
True.
So I guess kind of thinking of like go, no go criteria. Like, does this align with our business strategy, our product strategy, our innovation strategy? Like, is it worth the time and effort? So some grant consultancies offer grant writing, so you can work with a consultancy to do all that writing for you, but you still would have to collaborate with them and provide them the information that I've mentioned, like your sales forecast, etc. Because they can't write everything, they're not you. So you still need to provide them a lot of information. Also, some do reviews and coaching. So if you've written one, you can get feedback. You can also have coaching on a grant application as well, which will upskill you. So it's a bit more kind of structured in terms of your approach to it, because you're held accountable, doing the workshops, etc.
And I think that cost benefit is quite important. And I can see, I don't want to jump over, but I can see in your evaluate, go, no go, is this worth our time and effort is surely a key question to ask. But I'm just looking at the second box now. Like that, I think is probably the critical piece for me. Like, how do I start? How do we find the right grants? Is there a national repository or just a place, a directory we can go to find these grants?
I really wish there was, but there's not. It's very fragmented. So we've got the Knowledge Transfer Network website, which does largely bring a lot of the grants together. So if you go onto that and go onto sustainability, you'll see, I think there's about 3 pages of grants on there. So there's lots there. Then you've got UKRI, they've got a platform called No Limits. That's really good. Then you've got regional grants. So they did used to have the growth hubs, but now they're part of the councils, the local councils, and that kind of speaks also to the local grants as well. So there's a little bit of crossover there. So they usually have 2 types of grants available. So they have a revenue grant, which is for consultancy work, or doing something which will help your business grow, maybe innovate. And then you've got capital grants. So that's for buying, those kind of expensive machinery and all those kind of things that might not be relevant or suitable for other types of innovation grants. Then we've got Finder grant. Then with Europe, we've got Horizon Europe, Eureka Eurostar. Then we've got EIC, which is the European Innovation Council. So they've got a few different types of programs there. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to show an overview as to how to approach grants. So have that strategy and that plan, then find your grants, and then once you've found a grant, to read the eligibility and scope criteria, and then figure out, do we have the right team for it? Do we have the right technical skills, commercial skills? Do we have the match funding available? Is it the right time for us because of that long lead time?
Right.
Is it a good strategic fit? Is it a good project competition fit for us? Because if it's not, then it help you identify the gaps and think, okay, well, we're not ready this time for this competition because of X. Let's deal with that. Maybe, find like a university partner or whoever it might be. So if it was to come up again, then we're ready for it. But I also wanted to give an overview as to how long things take to apply. So if you're writing it yourself, bear in mind that sort of 80 to 100 hours, that is starting from scratch, by the way, like no prep. So if you're doing it yourself, then it's 3 to 4 weeks writing time. But also if you're using subcontractors, then they'll need to provide you a quote. So just need to kind of factor that in. And if you're working with partners, it might be a bit longer because you'll need to figure things out along the way, like the project plan, reviewing each other's work, just making sure you're on the same page. And with universities, as I mentioned, they have other paperwork that takes a long time, which is the JES forms, that's JES. That's something that they have to complete. And also the financials, which is done by their finance team, because it's a certain approach. It's a full economic cost that they have to do. So, that takes time. So that's why working with universities is great for credibility, but it can take quite a lot longer in terms of the writing and application process. And if you were to win it, then sometimes you can wait around sort of 1 to 2 months to hear. But I would never start a project like the day after the notification. Always leave around sort of 6 to 8 weeks after the notification date because of the due diligence. That can take a long time, because you'll need to set up like different contracts. They'll need to do that financial audit. There's quite a lot that needs to be done to set up a project. Yeah, and then if you don't win, you need to figure out like, do we try again, same competition or
Do they
another
give
competition?
feedback at all?
Yeah, they do give feedback. Yeah, yeah. So you'll know why you didn't win,
Yeah.
and
So
yeah.
just one bit of insight from myself. So what I have found is I've met startups who and projects who, I guess for lack of a better term, they sort of bullshit because
Mm,
and they kind of mold their business and what they're doing to try and fit the grant fund. I would advise against doing that, and I think a lot and
hmm.
it damages the direction of your business. It takes resource away from what your real goal is, and I think assessors can actually see right through that. But Chloe, you also touched on subcontractors.
Yeah.
Presumably here you mean grant writers. Is that a good idea, a bad idea? I mean, like how, if I'm a deeply technical business, how
Mm.
would I be reassured that a grant writer really understands what I'm trying to do? I can't expect them to have this deep depth of technical knowledge that I do. Is that a good idea
Mm.
or a bad idea? Can they be helpful?
So with a subcontractor, what I meant there is someone that will contribute towards the project, maybe from a
Right.
technical or design kind of
Not from a
perspective.
grant writing point of view.
No. So if you have a grant writer, that won't be an eligible cost because that activity happened before the grant project started. But to answer your question around the grant writing, you might need to kind of shop around a few grant consultancies just to see if maybe if the grant writers have got experience in your sector or
Mhm.
industry, and you might need to have a few conversations with them to build up the project to see if they really understand your project and what you're trying to achieve. Because if they do, and you kind of do that initially, then that will help you sort of gauge, I guess, the quality of the grant write, once they do it. Because if you're not that sort of confident that they have experience in your area, then you might think, maybe I'll try it somewhere else where they do, and they'll probably be able to contribute some of their knowledge
Yeah.
to write a better grant application.
Good, good. Right. So I'm just conscious of time.
Yeah.
We've got 10 minutes left, so I'm not going to just interrupt you anymore. So let's give us the key points.
Sure. Um, so the key points really are to start as early as possible, to also sign up for the newsletters from Knowledge Transfer Network. Yeah, just to start thinking about things as early as possible and think about grants as part of a strategy rather than like a serendipitous ad hoc. Heard someone got it, let's give it a try type of thing. It does take a long time, and it should be something that is taken as seriously with as much time and effort as a pitch deck. So I wanted just to quickly explain my course that I've got.
Mhm.
So I don't provide kind of grant writing or coaching or review services, but I do the training for grant funding, just because I've worked in this sector for such a long time,
Mm.
and this is an issue that I just see come up again and again, and it's something that I enjoy delivering. So I'm going to be doing a set of, well, two grant workshops with James, who I used to work with, and he's so experienced and he knows loads about grants. So I've written the online course. And we've got the two sessions on the 5th and the 7th of November in the morning. So I'm running a bit of a pilot, which means that if you're interested, I've got 10 spaces available. 7 have gone already. So I've got 3 available. They're on a first come, first served basis. So if you're interested in accessing the online course and coming along to these workshops for free, then email me at Chloe, Chloe, at sharp-insight.co.uk. So the point of the grant funding fundamentals is to give you an overview and insight as to how grants work from experienced grants consultants. So we can, in the grant course itself, we go through a lot of the things we've covered today. So things like the grants landscape, how to do a competition analysis for a grant application, how to analyze your market, and some tips and tricks for writing. So the course is not about how to write a grant, it's to help you prepare for a grant. So if you wanted to get a good understanding as to how the smart grant works, so if you were to write it or write with a grant writer, then you're in a really strong position to do so. So with this course, what happens in the live sessions is we go through a fictional case study and all the smart grant questions, so you can see the approach that we take when we're applying, and just the materials that you need to have ready. So the return on investment template, the sales forecast template, all that kind of stuff.
So this course will essentially give me everything I need to be prepped for the next
Yeah.
grant. Okay. I mean, that I would love for those last three spaces to be taken up by people on this webinar, by Growth Studio, and Growth Studio clients, startups. What's the value of this course if you were to buy it separately?
It's £425.
Okay, great. Look,
Yeah.
I think so. I would highly suggest if you are thinking about crowdfunding, if you are thinking that not crowdfunding, grant funding, if you are thinking that grant funding has a place in your roadmap, and I think for very many of at least our clients, it does. I would highly suggest you reach out to Chloe and try and get yourself on this course. The best that can happen is the moment a grant opportunity comes up, you're fully prepped. And I think the biggest challenge that startups have and founders have is time. So this is not only a great opportunity to learn more, but also just to make sure you look after your future self, essentially. Chloe, we've got some questions, but what I want to do is ask my fantastic counterpart, Paul, just to turn on his camera. And Paul, any questions for Chloe?
Hello. Yes, we've got a few questions in the chat and some that were DM'd. So what can I do outside of each grant application to improve my chances? Should I be raising my profile? Should I be going to events? Does that have an influence on successful grant applications?
Good question.
Yeah. Well, that is a good question. So I think going to the briefing sessions that they put on is important. Then you can understand the grant in more depth and have the opportunity to ask questions. But in terms of the profile, just make sure that your website and your online presence shows that you're credible and real, I suppose, because theoretically the assessor should not be going outside of the grant application, but sometimes they do Google the company name because that is available in the grant application. But all the information in the grant is confidential, so I won't share it. But they might just kind of, do a bit of their own research. And I have had an incident where there was a company who had not got a website, but the assessor thought that this company that had the same name was those that were applying, and they just were like, this doesn't sit right, because the industries were just so different, and then they lost a lot of points because they just couldn't figure out, like, why does this fit with your product, existing products? Why are you going to this market? Like, this team doesn't look credible, or like they don't have the technical experience. So I think it's important to have a good online presence in terms more around the website, and maybe your LinkedIn profile, just to show you that you're real.
So a question for me just on that: when you get your feedback from Innovate UK or whomever the grant, can you actually, is there an opportunity to challenge some of their feedback if they have clearly made a mistake, or if something hasn't been cleared, or if can you feedback to them and challenge?
And just adding on to that, can a decision ever be reversed?
That is a good question. So what you can do is request, after you've got all the feedback, you can request a breakdown of the individual scores. So you usually get an overview of the scores. And I don't think they're really allowing it for the smart grant, because they specifically say that they sort of discount outliers or something. I can't remember the terminology that they use, but there was a rule around, if the discrepancy between the average score and the outlier is more than 20%, then you can you can try to appeal it, but I haven't ever seen a decision be reversed. So
Okay, so
yeah.
someone in the chat said you can feedback, but you can't reverse the decision in real terms. Be prepared to launch a complaint. A couple of other questions that came through was and related to earlier on, is there anything you can do for grant writers, the human beings behind the grant assessors, sorry, that might influence their decision in terms of tone of voice, emphasis on social value, a personal story? Is there anything you can try and do outside of the rule book that might influence a decision?
I think just show that you're committed, you're confident, you're very serious about it, you're very committed, you've got everything in place that I've mentioned, like a realistic project plan. You've spent a lot of time and effort with realistic costing, which shows value for money. It's those things that add value, as well as a bit about this, your story and your motivation.
Perfect. Julia, I'm going to try and summarize your question, remind or refine it in the chat if I get this wrong, but the process and the principles and the frameworks that you went through, can these apply for social impact grants, like not-for-profits, to build advocacy, to get funding for those types of things as well?
I think so. A lot of the principles of grant funding can sort of extrapolate to sort of CIC, social enterprise charity, sort of non-profit grant applications. But there probably will be more emphasis on like the impact, like say social value, social return on investment. So those are the things that you might need to quantify more so in those applications compared to like an innovation grant.
Perfect. Couple more questions. Grant writers are notoriously expensive. They cost a fortune. You can't deduce their cost. How do you actually assess a good grant writer versus a bad grant writer if you were to try and get a grant writer to try and help you?
I think if they're trying to sell to you too hard, then they're probably not going to be the right fit, because they really should be selling themselves to you in that they've got the right knowledge, they're experienced, they've got maybe industry or sector experience. Ideally, you meet the grant writer, because sometimes you might work with agencies where you have the salespeople sort of in front of the grant writer. So you could ask for references. Maybe look at, yeah.
Like from my side, I think there's three things that we need to remember that we are bringing to the table alongside the grant writer. The grant writer is bringing the ability to articulate words on a bit of paper to submit. We are bringing three things to the table. We are bringing all the foundational knowledge and the pitch deck, the project plan. We need to be able to convey that. That's our job as founders. And the second thing we're bringing to the table is an ability or an understanding of how grants work. And I think this is why the course is quite critical. If we don't know how grants work, we'll never know whether what's being submitted by a grant writer is of good quality or bad quality. And the third thing we're bringing to the table is the technical expertise. I don't think we can ever expect a grant writer to understand your business in the depth that you do or we do. So work with a grant writer isn't just passing off the project to a grant writer. It's working in that real partnership. But it's so important that everyone understands exactly what the process is, what resonates with the assessors, and that will help you work out whether the grant writer you're working with is good or bad in the first place.
Yeah.
There could be plenty more questions. I'm conscious of time, Ryan. So
throw one quick one in there, and then I'll close off.
Innovate UK feedback isn't always quite what you want it to be. And I suppose very quickly, is there a way to use feedback from unsuccessful grants for future applications, or are they specific to a project?
Yes, you can reuse it. So what I like to do is color code it. So if it's all good, it's green. So that means I don't need to make any changes. If there's kind of substantial changes that I've made, so maybe that need to be made, so maybe around like the business model, or something wasn't right, then and I can change it, then I'll put that in red. But if it's kind of a bit like, I think that's a bit subjective, then I might make that orange. And then you'll be able to kind of see very quickly, just using that kind of RAG method, just what the general sort of sentiment was for that particular grant application. Usually they do have good points, but sometimes they don't agree. So I suppose it's kind of looking for the themes, like where is that commonality in terms of, maybe you've overestimated your market share or something like that. So you think, okay, that wasn't realistic. Maybe I could try that again. And things like that can be useful for future grant applications, because then you can adjust that specifically.
I'm gonna have to pause you there, and I think one last thing from my side is get other people to check it. There's people in your network who have actually done grant applications. See what they think. Chloe, thank you very, very much for your time. And just a reminder to everyone, please check out Growth Studio Select, our latest program that looks after you for the next 12 months. Please please email Chloe to learn more about the grant funding course. It's something that we absolutely suggest everyone does. And stay tuned for more webinars from Growth Studio. Thank you all very much.